event, the consequences were of far-reaching proportion and captured international attention. And what ended up happening in the aftermath of Heydrich's death in June of 1942, I won't describe the assassination in detail because it's beside the point, but it was successful. Heydrich did eventually die of his injuries after being wounded in an attack by resistance operatives. But what happened in the immediate aftermath was that on Hitler's orders, a village not that far from Prague, where Heydrich had been attacked, was completely annihilated as punishment. In the village of Lidice, which had a population at the time of about 500 people, suffered the loss of 340 residents, including about 80 children. Now, the men in the village were rounded up in June of 1942 and shot on the spot, right in the village. And most of the women and children were arrested and deported to murder facilities in Poland. And this is where most of the 80 children who perished ultimately were killed in the gas chambers that were also being used to carry out the Holocaust. So altogether, as far as anyone seems to know, fewer than 10 children from the village survived, and these children were spared only because Nazi doctors believed that they had sufficiently Germanic features that they could be re-educated and adopted into German families. So here, on top of the destruction of the village, the Nazis also appropriated some of the children and tried to convert them into German children by adopting them out to German families, and that's really a whole other story. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the assassination of Heydrich, although it could be easily justified on moral grounds because of the criminal actions that he was responsible for, both in terms of his involvement with the Holocaust as well as his involvement with the repressive occupation of Czechoslovakia, ended up costing the lives of hundreds of innocent individuals who had no say in the matter of whether or not the assassination should happen. And of course, these individuals had nothing to do with it. But this was the typical pattern that followed acts of resistance. Usually, the innocent would pay the price. And whether or not the political motives for the justification make any sense, I'll leave it up to you to decide. But the reason that I raise the issue is that resistance comes with a price, and not just for the individuals who risk their lives in the act of resistance, but for a whole range of bystanders as well. And while the individuals who engage in resistance at least have the opportunity to make a choice about what might happen to them, because they know if they carry out these actions that they could probably pay with their lives, innocent bystanders didn't have a choice and paid very dearly a high price for this assassination, which in the grand scheme of things made no difference to the outcome of the war, or for that matter, the continued pursuit of the mass murder of European Jews in the Holocaust. So to finish up with our discussion of some of the moral and ethical challenges or problems of resistance to occupation, we should look at the fairly complex case of partisan warfare, especially in the Soviet Union, in the parts of the Soviet Union that were occupied by German forces after the middle of 1941. Nowhere else in the European context do we find such pronounced levels of violence against the occupation troops and occupation authorities on the part of partisan resistors in the form of sabotage, guerrilla warfare attacks, and all kinds of general troublemaking in the vast areas which were under German occupation, but not really fully controlled by the German occupation authorities. And this was especially notable in Belarus, which was under German control from the very early part of the war in the Soviet Union. Belarus geographically featured extensive forested areas and wetlands, which were perfect for partisan operations because the partisans could build their bases deep in the forests and then come out to strike the Germans when it suited them and then withdraw back into their hiding places in the forests. And of course, the people that bore the brunt of the punishment for these attacks were not simply the partisans themselves, but civilians living in towns and villages throughout Belarus who were left out in the open, and often the only ones that the Germans could find to punish after an attack had taken place. And there was very little difficulty on the German side in abandoning any pretense of civility in dealing with local civilians, because after all, it was part of the German master plan for the occupation and colonization of the Soviet Union to eradicate all of the Soviet people anyhow. So if they were going to do it later, they might as well do it sooner, in cases where there was lots of partisan activity. And German commanders who wanted to rationalize this could simply say, well, we don't know exactly who the partisans are, so we'll just punish everybody and assume that there's going to be some partisans among them. And remember, too, that this is happening in the same context as the mass murder that's being carried out by the Einsatzgruppen against the Jews living in these occupied territories. So killing more civilians on top of Soviet Jews, nobody on the German side has a problem with that. And of course, this was all fully appreciated by the authorities in Moscow, who were carefully directing the partisan activities, usually by radio, but also by dropping officers and commanders into the partisan areas so that they could assume control of the partisan networks. And as far as Moscow was concerned, any Soviet civilian who was not actively resisting was a traitor anyhow. So if they were going to try to somehow sit on the fence, then they deserved to be killed or mistreated by the Germans. And if not, then they should join the resistance movements and go to the woods where the resistors were operating. So on both sides, there was a lot of cruel calculation as far as the fate of civilians was concerned in terms of these partisan activities. And even in situations where civilians might be able to avoid punishment by the Germans, the fact is that they were continually harassed by the partisans themselves, who needed the supplies and the food and milk and other supplies that could be provided by the Soviet farmers living in the occupied areas. So here the civilians were really caught in a deadly vice between the partisans themselves and between the German occupation forces. And the problem only became more and more pronounced as the war went on. Because in 1941 and early 1942, there were already large partisan cells which were formed initially from Soviet troops who had been cut off behind the German lines but refused to surrender. And then, because the front was so large, it was often possible for the Red Army to infiltrate more resistors, more uniformed resistors, into the rear parts of the German occupation zone to join the already operating resistance cells. So the level and intensity of violence simply increased over time. It caused the Germans all kinds of far-reaching problems. It had a real impact on their warfighting capabilities, but it also exacted an enormous deadly toll on the civilian population. So the bottom line here is that irrespective of the circumstances that we're talking about, when you have violent resistance activities against an occupation force in the Second World War, usually it ends badly for bystanders who have very little to do with the resistance in one way or another. And I think this is a part of resistance that is often overlooked in romantic depictions of resistance activities, whether in novels or films or that kind of thing. And we could give lots of other examples if we had time, but for the time being, I think we better leave things where they stand. Okay, thank you.